The roots were a web beneath the world, pale as bone, tasting of rain and iron and old blood, and Bran learned their pathways the way one learns the lines of a hand. He lay in the caverns dim, the breath of the cave cold as a promise, his own breath shallow, his body an afterthought now, a husk to anchor him while his mind climbed the scaffolds of time. The old man's eyes were closed. He slept sometimes for seasons at a stretch, and the children of the forest moved with quiet hands and softer steps, tending fires that gave light but little heat. The air smelled of moss and damp earth and the faint sweetness of the weirwood's sap. It had been a long while since he had wept, and yet sometimes water gathered unbidden at the corner of his eye and moved sideways into his hair, as if the roots themselves were drawing tears into their attentions. He could hear the breathing of slumbering things as one might hear surf in a shell. Wolves in winter dens, men and women in keeps and crofts and cellars, a boy counting his heartbeats beneath a featherbed, a queen counting her losses beneath a crown. Hearing was the least of it. Seeing had come early, riding the green tide as easily as he'd once ridden a saddle. The third sense was the hardest to call by name. Not taste, not touch. It was the sense of being read by the trees as much as reading them, of being known by ravens between their wing beats, of belonging to a chorus that had sung before men shaped words. In the ebb and flow of that song another sound rose, a memory he had not asked to remember. Hodder's last breath, and the ruin of his mind, and the door that had needed holding. The cost had a shape, and Bran had learned it by hand. He knew what a command could do if it was thrust like a blade into a mind that had trusted him. He had sworn to himself, no gods to hear, except these quiet, red-eyed gods, that he would not waste any other man's self to save his own heart from breaking. Yet the world broke all the same. It cracked across a night that had not yet happened. The past held key after key, and Bran had taken up a set with hands that still looked like a child's in his mind's eye. He could close and open doors with a whisper if he chose the door well. His father's voice in memory, even the echo of it, even a smile shaped by it, was as stark and plain as the walls of Winterfell. Do what you must, but know what it is. He had missed the chance to save one friend at a door. He had watched his mother die a world ago, watched his father bend his neck beneath a sword. The world had given him visions and returned nothing he loved. There was one wound that had bled the slowest and longest, one he could still taste in the weirwood sap, brined with winter. The war that had sown grief into every house and city and field. Some call it a rebellion and some a romance, and both were true. Both had been an excuse for fire. The thought of it pricked him even now. If the roots ran through time, if the eyes of the trees were also windows, if the soft hands of the children had led him into the river of things to learn how to swim back, then he would swim to where the first stones had gone into the water. He would catch them before they sank. He learned the names of the stones as if they were cousins. A song beneath a weirwood at Harrenhal. A crown of blue winter roses. A woman with a temper like a gallop. A prince who measured prophecy with his fingers as if it could be weighed. A king who loved his fires too much, and the dry-mouthed men who whispered to him about them. A brother who loved too fiercely and too fast. A storm lord whose laughter filled halls the way banners fill wind. A friend in reed-gray clothes with a knife of bone. A raven perched inside the ear of a man who had lived more by his wits than by blood. Bran closed his eyes and the cavern vanished. He felt the old roots curling around him like the grip of a hand that had held stones and spears and children. He sunk into the wood, and the wood took him as a river takes a boat. He forgot hunger because the trees do not hunger. He forgot sleep because the stones do not sleep. He went north and south, and then he went back to the year when men were younger and yet themselves. Water ran over rock. A wind came through a stand of willows carrying laughter. He reached for the laughter and found, instead, a boy sitting under a willow at the edge of a lake, binding a scratch on his forearm with a strip of damp linen. The boy's hair was dark as wet earth. His hands were delicate and sure. A dragonfly haloed his knee and fled when the boy's friend called to him. "Howland," said a girl's voice, full of mischief and weather. "My Lord Cranigman, are you sulking?" Bran breathed in the slow, sappy breath of a nearby weirwood, and the world sharpened. On another bank of the lake, for squires were laughing with the humor that comes easiest to those who own the ground beneath their boots. Reed had come to watch knights unhorse knights. He had come to see what men wore when they were made of song instead of mud. He had come only to see and been made to taste humiliation. His smallness punished by boys who would grow into men who could draft punishments as if drawing up maps. The girl's eyes flashed, and she was younger than Bran had thought she would be, and sharper, and already wearing the impatience of someone who had always moved faster than those around her. Lyanna Stark came like a gust, bringing leaves and laughter both. Bran knew he could sharpen the moment or dull it in different ways. He could whisper to the squires and make their hands clumsy. He could make the willow's branch break at the right time. He did none of it. He watched what had always happened, and he let it happen again. The girl's indignant chiding, the squire's mock backs bent, the stung pride in their laughter. It was a small fire that would feed a larger one, but still it had not yet been fanned. When the day skated forward, RD to the first summons of the tourney, Bran followed a raven's dark eye into the shadows beneath the stands. He found a man tuning a harp. The prince's hair was dark as ink, and he had that distant hunger in his gaze that men mistake for sadness, but that is closer to counting. He plucked a string and frowned when the note wavered. He plucked another. "You are looking for a sound you cannot name," Bran wanted to tell him. "That will make a man's life a series of befores and afters." It would have been easy to whisper then, through the hair-thin vein of weirwood that the builders had preserved by accident in the heart of an old post. Easy to make the words come from the rasp of the wind that finds every stage and scaffold. But words said to princes become iron. Bran held his tongue, if the wind had won, and waited, the way trees wait through winters broader than a kingdom. When Howland Reed came to the Godswood at dusk the following day, alone and stung by losing a half-remembered argument with someone larger than he knelt beneath the great white face and pressed his forehead to the root that surfaced like a knuckle. The weirwood's leaves had the dull purple of the hour when lamps are lit. In the red eyes of the tree the light gathered and changed. Bran had thought of Howland's quiet and Lyanna's noise as separate instruments in a song, but together they made a harmony more surprising than he had allowed. The old gods, Reed breathed, seeking. Old, yes, and gods by the only definition that matters, those that witness and remember. Bran remembered and watched. He had learned the hard way that one should not open a door with a shout when a whisper will lift the latch. He breathed his breath into the slow, inexorable draw of the tree. His notice became the tree's notice. He turned the sight of the leaves in the wind into an intention, as a mason turns a block of stone into a corner. And when he spoke like water making its own path. "You live," said a voice without a mouth, "by knowing what you are not." Reed startled. His hand flinched to his knife and did not draw it. "I honor the old gods," he said, steadying himself with the words. "You honor all that came before you," said the whisper. "And that is wisdom. The road ahead is as narrow as a knife, but not all men must bleed to walk it." The man bowed his head, humble without humiliation. "I am a small reed in a deep marsh," he murmured, one of the sayings of his people. "Small reeds bend and do not break," said the leaves. "Listen, Howland of Greywater. Listen with your marsh lungs and your reed ears. Words will be asked of you. Give them without pride. When music is offered, beware of visions that crowd out the flesh and the blood." He stayed very still, as if he could freeze himself into an image for the god to read at leisure. "You are the grove," he said, "and I am only a man." "You are a man," the whisper agreed. "And there is more strength in that than princes know." Bran felt his own heart beat, slow and far from the present scene. He had told Reed nothing that pinned anyone to anything. He had given a gift shaped like clarity. He withdrew, slowly, so that the moment could quiet around the crannogman like snow around a sleeping wolf. When the prince sang that night, Bran had to admit the man knew chords that could loosen bones. Birds outside the tent quieted. Even the dogs tilted their heads. The careful fingers called for something beyond crowns and vows. The song ended in a silence that felt expensive to break. Rhaegar listened to the silence as if it would answer him. Bran watched from the border of leaf and shadow and thought, not for the first time, that the scariest thing about men like this is that they tell themselves the truth only when it pleases them. The tilt the next day was a map come to life. Faces he knew from stories looked out through slits in their helmets like the eyes of painted saints. When the moment came, when the prince had carried all before him and the air itself turned its face toward the dais to see which woman his arm would lift into a statue for a heartbeat, Bran felt the tug of what men call fate, which can be as simple as habit and as dangerous as hunger. He did not put a hand to it. He did not cloud the prince's eye nor knot the horse's knee. He let the roses go where the prince's fancy sent them. Blue petals fell into a lap that had been fretted over and whispered about, and 100 mouths rounded into small os, and one girl folded herself around her amazement and her anger at herself for being amazed. It had always happened that way, and now it happened again. Bran did not flinch from it. He did not have to like the past to admit it. He watched how faces changed, how one man's jaw clenched and then eased because to clench too long would have betrayed him. He watched a smile that looked like a promise and a promise that tasted like wine. He noted them the way a woodsman notes the lay of branches before choosing where to swing the axe. The tree at Harrenhal was older than the wooden suppliants men had nailed their petitions to. It had drunk vows and secrets in equal measure, the way a hollow log drinks rain. In its shade on the third night of feasts, the prince found the girl, or the girl found the prince. The ground there was soft from centuries of leaf fall. The root rose like a shoulder in the earth, and there were nests of leaves where a girl could sit and think she watched without being watched. Bran went into the tree as a man puts one foot into a stream and felt the cold come up to his knee. He did not push hard. He waited until their silence collected in cups and began to spill. "I must look a fool to you," Lyanna said. She had thrown off a shawl as if it had been a mask, and the evening breeze teased at her unbound hair. "I do not like to be made a fool. I do that well enough myself." "I think you look like a story," said the prince. He had set the harp down and as rubbing his left thumb absently, where a callus told more truth than any jewel he wore. "I think you look like something I have failed to understand and now cannot look away from. I thought princes were trained not to say such things," she said, with a disdain she was learning even as she tried it on. "I was trained to hear songs better than men," he said. "Songs do not cheat at dice," she said. "Nor do they quarrel nor laugh," he said. A small smile tugged at his mouth and did not fully arrive. "They ask for all the parts of men that are easiest to sing." Her brow drew tight as if in concentration. "I know what songs do," she said. "They steal things. They make you drunk when there is no wine. They make you forget your brothers have voices and your father has a temper. They make you look at your betrothal as if it were a line in a ballad instead of a hard winter to be gotten through." "You do not want the winter," Rhaegar murmured. "I want my brothers to be alive when winter comes," she said. There it was, the first true sentence of hers he had heard this night. Bran, a breath in the leaves, could have reached for it and made it bigger. He did nothing. He let it stand like a tree trunk in the mind of each of them. "Prophecies are winter," the prince said almost to himself. "They are maps drawn in frost. You have to move quickly to read them before they melt." "Is that what you want?" she asked. "To chase your map? Will you chase it wherever it runs?" He lifted his gaze and met hers fully then, engaging the part of him that had tuned the harp until it could sing to metal. "I want the thing itself, not the chase," he said. "But the chase is all we are given. We are made of chases." "Then choose what you chase," she said. "Choose it with your eyes open." He opened his hands. "What would you have me choose?" "My brothers," she said without thinking, scrunching her nose as if the words had come out in the wrong order. "Your wife," she added lower. "Lady Lyanna," he said, the courtesy holding very still between them. "I mean no dishonor to the Princess of Dorne. You did not have to set a crown in my lap to dishonor a woman," she said dryly. "You could have sent her a song." He flinched then, barely. The truth of that was in his wrist. He looked down at his hand, at the callus. "Choose to be a man who does not steal because a song told him to," she said. Choose to be a man who does not burn because fire told him there would be light. He frowned in confusion. Burn? He asked. What? And Bran allowed more of the tree through, the memory in the wood, the taste of smoke drawn decades ago and still clinging to the inner rings. He did not show the prince a court in terror. He did not impose on him the sound of a man screaming in metal. He let the wind make the leaves chatter like frightened teeth and let the moment fragment into fragments of warning. Rhaegar looked up at the canopy as if the leaves had said his name. Princes are not trained to hear the old gods. The faith teaches other languages. But there is something in the bone that hears a creak swell when the thaw begins, and Rhaegar had bones. He closed his mouth on whatever he had been about to say. When he looked back at the girl, it was with a care that had not been there when he'd first spoken to the night. Walk with me, he said instead. Not into a song, into the dark, and then back out of it. He paused, measuring. With witnesses. With, she began, and then smiled small. Bring Howland Reed, she said. He is not yours and not mine. He sees things I don't. He knows my temper. He knows your song. Reed, he repeated, tasting the name. Bran smiled in the bark, if a tree can smile. The shape he had nudged had begun to recognize itself. He withdrew to the fringe of the godwood and watched the two shadows stroll into the deeper shade, their talk quieter now. He turned his notice to the marsh boy, who was working an edge on his bone knife so fine you could mistake it for a strand of hair. Howland listened when asked to listen. He came to the godwood and was shown respect by people who had forgotten lately that respect is the right amount of attention given to the right kind of creature. They spoke beneath the eye of a face that was generations deep in its silence. The prince did not ask the reeds for permission to move the wind. He asked instead what they knew of winds that arrive before storms. Lyanna spoke bluntly and with hands that cut the air, and in the places where her words might have turned sharp, Howland smoothed them with the way river pebbles are smoothed, not by force, but by constancy. At the edge of the talk, there was a question like a dog waiting for scraps. If Lyanna was a story, who was telling it? If the prince was a map, who would get lost following it? Bran counted 3 times that night when he could have pushed with the smallest pressure and altered the next day forever. He did not. That was the difficulty of it. Doing nothing was a kind of work, and it tempted him constantly to overdo. He did not dissuade Rhaegar from his roses. He did not urge Lyanna toward disdain for the whole idea of love. It would have been easy enough to curdle that word into a joke she told at feasts. The North sometimes equates cynicism with strength. He kept his hands off that idea as if it were a nettle. Let the girl keep her wild heart. Let the man keep his harp. Only let them keep their word as well. He sent one more whisper into the wood, a breath that barely stirred a leaf. Each of you will be asked, he told them, though it sounded only like the shiver of a tree told by wind that the wind exists, to choose between the chase and the holding. When you choose, count a cost that is not yours alone. He went back then, to the cavern that smelled like old pages and cold damp. The children watched him emerge with the patience of creatures who had seen men try to pick up time like a fallen coin and put back. The old man's eye opened a slit and then closed again, as if even seeing cost him now. Bran ate a bit of nut paste, and though hunger was mostly a word now, the taste of it snapped him into a body long enough to remind him that the body was not done with him. If he did too much too quickly, it would remind him harder. He slept with his cheek pressed to the weirwood's root. He dreamt of a blue flower growing in a patch of snow that spread and then withdrew, leaving the ground wet and dark and ready to sprout something else. He woke with the sweetness of that scent in his mouth and the certainty that time was less a circle than a braided rope, strands crossing, straining, loosening, tightening again. He had touched 2 strands at once and made them aware of each other. Awareness would do much of the work for him. He hoped. The tourney ended as all bright things do, in the memory of those who had not lost money on it and in the accounting of those who had. Men rode away flushed with victory or sobered by loss, and women folded dresses and gossip in equal measure, packing both for long roads. Lyanna rode north with her brothers and with Howland Reed, who traveled alongside like a small gray fish at the edge of a larger creature. and the prince went south first and then east to the place he had a right to call home but seldom did. He played his harp less, perhaps, and stared at maps more. He wrote a letter to his wife that was not poetry. It told of duties, and duties are of a kind with love when they are cleanly done. Bran followed in parts, like a wind that returns to particular corners of a house because it knows the sound they make when empty. In the north, winter made a practice of arriving without announcing itself, as a stern ant might. The wolves ran in packs that were arranged like families in politics. Ned Stark learned to set his jaw in ways that winter respected. Brandon ran horses because horses taught him he could never go fast enough. Benjen watched from shadows he did not yet know he had chosen. Lyanna argued with the cold and challenged it to race her across an iced-over stream. The ice won the first race and her laughter won all the others. Howland Reed vanished when he chose and arrived when he decided arrival might do some good. In the south, the king counted his fears like coins. His fingers were stained, not with ink, but with something that had a smell even the weirwoods disliked. Varys moved across the floor of the red, keep the way a drop of oil moves across water, rarely mixing, always shaping. Pycelle practiced the art of seeming deaf until the moment came to repeat something a king needed to hear in the voice of the thing that had first whispered it. The Kingsguard shined their armor and their vows. One lad among them still looked at his oaths as if he had been given the wrong set of vows at the sept and could not exchange them without insulting the gods. There were a dozen points at which the world could have cracked all the same. Bran stood at each one as if at a narrow bridge without rails. He grew thinner in his body and thicker in the wood. At Winterfell, shortly after the first snow, a letter came from the Vale with words that had been composed by someone else and corrected by Jon Arryn's hand. The mentor's edits made the boy's spill of affection less sloppy and more earnest. Robert Baratheon's words in his own scrawl ran like a dog that ran because it could not help itself. He called Ned a dozen things that meant companion and brother. He said he would make a bed of summer as soon as he could and bring it north to end the winter, and laughed at himself in the next sentence for sounding like a song. He asked for a few lines to Lyanna and then crossed them out. He began again. Bran watched over that letter like a small, intense storm. At Winterfell's solar, in light so pale the stones looked like bones. Ned read the letter aloud, stopping at the crossed lines and frowning. "He is not skilled at keeping secrets," Catelyn would have said. Catelyn was not here. A different young woman would sleep beneath Winterfell stones in a different future now. A different set of children would practice with wooden swords in the yard. Bran had learned to accept that changing one thing meant changing things he had not meant to touch. A weave is not a thread. Lyanna took the letter in her hands and held it lightly, as if it were a bird that might spook. "What does he say for himself?" Brandon demanded, pacing, his annoyance at not having been written to more obvious than he intended. "That he intends to come north in spring," Lyanna said. Her tone was neutral. She looked up at the window with its triangle of gray sky. "He says he intends to drink the alehouse dry between the neck and the wall. He says I am the..." She pursed her mouth. "He says things that are not anyone's business." Brandon laughed, pleased for his sister and pleased for his own ease. Ned looked a question at her and received a shrug. Lyanna folded the letter and set it on the table and paced it once as if measuring it for a saddle. "He is a storm," she said. "He is," Ned said, so mild it could have sounded like mockery. It was not. "I do not despise storms," Lyanna said. "I like the way they clear the air. But if you live in one too long, you forget the shape of your own house." "He will be faithful to you," Ned said, meaning it. The words came from a heart that had known Robert as a boy who put his hand out and drew people into his circle as simply as he drew breath. "That is not a thing storms do," Lyanna said softly. "They are honest while they are over you." She looked at her brothers then, and something in her softened further. "I will not be foolish," she said. "I will not run into a storm and say it was a meadow, but I will not spit into the wind and then cry that I am wet. I will ask things of him, not songs, days where he will be still. That is not a trade he why. Like," Brandon said bluntly. "It will be a trade he will make or not," Lyanna said. "And I will know what I am buying." Howland, Ned said later when he and Reed stood in the yard watching Lyanna run a horse. My sister lets you see the part of her she thinks is foolish. You must be a very rich man to be trusted with that much. His tone was gentle, teasing and grateful both. Rich in waters, Reed said with a small smile that could have been a grimace. Your sister has a strong current. She can carve channels where she flows long enough. Will she carve one in the Stormlands? Ned asked. She will carve one in herself, Reed said and left it at that. Bran let the months turn. He watched the king chew his nails to the quick and sleep with his hands clenched. He watched Rhaegar set his harp aside and write lists of lords as if the names themselves were a song. He watched Elia with her children, the tenderness in her hands a lesson for anyone who could see. He watched Oberyn Martell dance in a room with too many candles and smile with too much knowledge. He watched young Jaime polish his vows until he could see his face in them. He watched Tywin weigh affronts on a scale that had been calibrated when he was a boy and never recalibrated since. He watched Varys take in a breath at certain tidings and let it go at others, delicate as a musician at the end of a phrase. There were moments when the past tried to find its old ruts like a wagon seeking familiar grooves. One such came in a small thing. A rider from the south arriving at Winterfell with a rumor shaped like a letter to no one in particular. There were words for Lyanna in it like a lure. Bran watched the messenger, young and foolish and angry that the North had not been impressed more by the South's importance. If the rumor had found a particular ear at a particular hour, Brandon might have gone off like dry thatch. Bran did not break the boy. He sent a raven to the rookery, and the raven brought a caw that sounded like wait, and Maester Luwin kept the messenger in the warmth a moment longer with a question about the weather in the Riverlands. And by the time the boy spoke loud in the yard, the dinner bell had rung and the day's edge had dulled and Brandon's temper had found something else to occupy it. Another rut came later, bigger. A mischance at a way house on the King's Road where two parties met at the wrong hour. In one, a pair of men who kept a tongue ready for insult. In the other, a steward whose lord had taught him to carry himself like a lord and demand respect when he failed to receive it. Words hit words and made sparks, and a knife leaped to hand out of sheer habit, and a horse kicked, and the scene could have ended in a dead man whose name would have become a banner. Bran sent a chill wind down the back of the steward's neck, as if a mother were calling his childhood name from a back door. He turned his head, and in that heartbeat the horse's kick met air instead of skull. The knife cut only fabric. The words burned out not because they were well handled, but because they were poorly timed. Nobody goes to war in a badly timed hour. They wait until the hour suits them. Bran bought time the way misers buy grain. He was not always subtle. There came the summons that would have ended the Stark men as surely as a clean blade. The king, moved by a sudden rattle of paranoia struck by an invisible mallet, sent for Lord Rickard to answer imaginary charges first and actual ones later. The letter was in the king's hand but not in his mind. Men had penned it for him and his signature trailed the ink like an afterthought. Varys said little. Pycelle allowed a cough to be a signal and then allowed it to be a cough. Bran leaned into the wood of Winterfell and breathed that breath that no one can identify when they feel it, the one that moves curtains and hair and makes men rub at their necks. He let the gods would give Lord Rickard a dream that night. The dream was not a vision. It was a memory of the man's father, stern as a frost, giving him advice in a voice that had once frightened him and now steadied him. Ask who profits. Ask who profits from your absence. The dream woke him before dawn, and he sat on the edge of his bed with his back aching as if from a ride too long, and he summoned his sons and spoke evenly. The king's letters are not commands, he said. They are invitations to danger. We will send a response that is dignified and useless. We will not place our heads under a blade because someone said they wished to see the edge glint. Brandon argued in his way, forward and unafraid. Ned asked which messenger could carry dignity that far south and not disturb it. Benjen watched his father's face and learned from it a lesson that would shape many of his nights thereafter. They sent a reply that said nothing and explained less. It was the kind of letter men had built politics around for generations. The court down south chewed it like a bone and found it tougher than it looked. With the invitation not accepted, the king's mood swung. as moods do when defeated by a wall of indifference. He turned his vexations toward men closer at hand. The court grew brittle. Rhaegar moved, finally, with the kind of care men mistake for courage, and sometimes it is courage. He went to his father and did not bring his harp. He said the word council as if it were a prayer and the word change as if it were a woman's name. The king snarled and struck words like sparks off stone, and when sparks did not ignite, he stored them in his robe like a child with stolen sweets for later. Jaime stood at his shoulder as still as a cutout. Aerys said things about traitors and fires, and because no one in the room had the power in that moment to call a thing madness when madness is what it was, the madness wore a mask made of policy. It fooled the foolable. Bran had feared that room. He had watched it claim men before. He put his attention into a grain of the wood beneath the king's chair, which had been a live tree once, and he let the memory of its roots, deep and drinking cool water, rise into the air like a faint scent, until the king paused, begrudgingly calmed by a sensation he would never name. He did not recant. Madness does not recant. It merely chooses a later hour. Rhaegar had expected a battle and received a delay. He took it because delays are tools. By spring the roads grew soft under hooves. Robert came north with a train not large enough to be contemptuous and not small enough to be modest. He rode at the head because he could not imagine not doing so, and the horse under him was pleased to have a rider who told it what to be. The first look he threw at Winterfell was a child's who had dreamed of a wild place and found it real. He hugged Ned with enough force to make bones speak. He lifted Benjen off the ground as if to test whether the boy had hidden wings. He bowed to Lord Ricard with a respect unpolished by court. He turned at last to Lyanna like a man who has chosen to stare down a hawk and behave as if it were a pigeon. "Lady," he said. His voice was a laugh with a scar under it. "Lord," she said with a tilt of her chin, whose angle was known to every man in Winterfell as the one that came before trouble and could be persuaded to come before joy. They walked the yard once together with Ned at Robert's elbow and Brandon making comments under his breath meant for the air to hear. The words they spoke were not as important as the speed at which they spoke them. He spoke quickly. She did not. He learned to slow on the second lap. On the third lap, he made a jest at his own expense that unknitted her mouth. On the fourth lap, he asked no questions about songs, about the tourney, about roses. He asked about wolves. He asked about the sound the wind made in the high passes near the wall. "The wind sounds different there," she told him. "It comes from a place that is not determined to reassure you." "Good," he said, surprising himself. "I like honesty. You like victory," she said. "They are not opposed," he said, and looked at his own hands. "So I have heard. Do you always hear things and go find whether they are true?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without pride. "And when I find they are true, I take them up like a hammer. And when they are not, I leave them alone." "And what will you take up if you find I am not a song?" she asked. "I am a woman who shouts at horses and will want to ride when you wish me to sit and will want to listen when you wish me to sing. I will take up a chair and sit beside you while you ride," he said. "Unless you forbid me to watch. I will stand at the fence like a boy and chew grass and pretend the dust does not sting." "You have never done that," she said, eyes dancing in a way that made Ned feel both elderly and young. "I have done it for less," he said simply, and it was true enough that it struck them both as honorable. Ned watched and Howland Reed watched and Brandon watched, and each saw the thing he expected to see. Bran watched from a shadow in the Godswood where green light makes fair judgments harsher and harsh ones fairer. He did not change their words. He only set his attention on the space between their mouths and their ears so that what each had the capacity to hear did not have to cross a field of old noise to arrive. Robert's laugh, which had put men off their balance, softened when he met no resistance at first. Lyanna's guard, which had kept her from believing in the value of her own demands, loosened when she heard him agree without giving himself away. They did not marry then. That would come later, after a journey south where women measured fabrics and men measured glances. But they set to learning one another the way a knight learns a horse, testing with hands and silences more than by blows. Bran could not forget what he had seen in a future where this had gone another way. He remembered as if his mind had been bruised by it. A girl in a tower miles away from every oath with a bundle in her arms. A hiss of words spoken to a brother made older by grief. A battle hammered to pieces by a king's madness. A city taken when bells should have rung and did not. A baby who would not cry because crying makes you live longer, and this child had a better teacher than that. He remembered bodies covered inadequately by cloth that could not keep cold off even in summer. He remembered men making speeches over them that cloaked their own terror. He had watched the road to that place this time and put rocks at its mouth and called to travelers that the road was closed. Not everyone would heed the call. Men who had meant to profit by war had sharp eyes for detours, but he could force none of them onto that path this season. He would not look away to allow them to stumble upon it. Down south, Rhaegar visited the hill where the skulls of dragons stared at dust, and he imagined them speaking. He kept his imagination to himself. He walked with Varys in the gardens, where oranges unbutton themselves into sunshine and give it back while dying. The eunuch spoke of lords not yet ready to listen to words like reform. He spoke of men who had grown used to being tangled in one another's purposes. He spoke of time and the way it can seem abundant to a man who will outlive most of those he must persuade, and scarce as water to a woman whose children will outlive her only if the city does not burn this week. Varys said nothing of the boy across the sea. He had learned a new respect for the weirwood's attention and did not like to speak into spaces where he felt watched. That was enough. Silence, too, is a lever. Rhaegar thought of his children and then of the son he believed he was owed by a promise he did not remember making. He thought about duty until the word flattened. In that flatness he went to Elia and called her what her father had called her, life of life, and she smiled at a smile that did not ask him for songs. Ares had been thwarted in small things and would have his large thing. Men brought him jars of wildfire the way suitors bring a girl bracelets. He grinned and saw himself younger in green light. He spoke poetry of sorts about purifying flames. He sniffed the air as if he could smell treason, and in that act smelled only his own sickness. One of the pyromancers had a hand that shook after he set a lamp down. He had sons. He had come to fire because it offered certainty in a world of gray. Bran put a memory in the tremor and let it travel up the man's arm to his shoulder. A memory of a summer's day in boyhood when he had nearly dropped a jar of honey and caught it, and the sweetness had broken over his fingers, and he had licked it away without shame and had been called foolish by an uncle who had stiff morals and softer hands. He remembered not the uncle's words but the grin elsewhere that had told him to ignore them. He remembered the taste, brief, unrepeatable. It was not much, but when he set the lamp down the next time, the jar did not shake, and the king's eye slid past him for want of anything to grip. Bran could not cure the king. He could delay him. He could make madness wait for its supper and sometimes go to bed with only a crust. The day came when Robert and Lyanna were asked to stand before a septon and say words that had been said enough times to wear smooth. Brandon took the vows with alternate impatience and gleam for being next to take them himself for Catelyn Tully. The hall smelled of bread and the perfume in women's hair and the smoke from the torches. Lyanna wore a dress that made her mutter only once in private to Nan about the idiocy of lace. Robert wore a look that surprised everyone who had thought they knew all his faces. He looked like a man who has been handed something breakable and valuable and wants desperately not to be the one to drop it. Ned had to turn away then because the look hurt something inside him he thought long since calloused. They walked afterward into the Godswood because Lyanna did not trust a marriage that had not been sealed by trees. Robert stood before the red face and kept his eyes on his wife instead because he did not know the proper reverence to show a god who looks like a man caught in a scream, and he had not come here to fake reverences. Lyanna took his hand and put it to the bark and said simply, "Listen," and he listened, and the only thing he heard was the wind. It was enough. If there is a hinge of history, it is often a private one. It is not always a coronation or a charge. It is sometimes a sigh heard only by two. On the first night, they were alone enough to be honest. Lyanna said, "I do not want to be your excuse." Robert laughed and then stopped because the words tasted serious. "I do not want to be your prize," she said. "I will not be the reason you drink like a boy or fight like a boy. I will be the reason you become a man of hours and days, not dreams." "That sounds like a chore." he said frankly, grateful to be allowed to call anything by its true name in this new room he did not own. "It is," she said, "and I will be a chore to you, but I am worth doing." He looked at her then and did not answer with a song. He answered with a question. "What days?" he asked. "Name them." She named one day a week when he would not drink. She named one day a month when he would ride his own lands without a company, only with her if she wished to go, and look at the faces of the men who paid for his wine and his war. She named 2 days a year when he would sit with a book and a man who could read it better than he, and he would listen to the way law sounds when it is written with more care than it is executed. She named mornings, back to back, when he would sit in the yard and hear complaints until the man with the smallest complaint had been heard. "You will make me dull," he said, not in anger. "I will make you strong," she said, not in boasting. "I do not," he laughed. "I do not know if I can do it. I have never kept 2 things in my hand at once." "You kept Ned," she said. "You kept him even when he did not know you kept him. Keep me the way you kept him, by showing up." He stared at her, then grinned, then held out his hand. "I will fail," he said, "more than once. I will remind you," she said, "more than once, more than you will like. And if you forget again and again, then we will find something else we are good at that allows you to be what you are without breaking the things you love." "What am I?" he asked simply. "A storm with a hearth in it," she said. "Most storms burn the hearth. Learn to be both." He kissed her then because there are things that words do not fix and some that they begin. It was enough to make the next day possible. Brandon married Caitlin by the river that had taught her father patience not to build more bridges than the water could afford. Peter Baelish watched from a distance with an expression that looked like nothing to anyone who did not know him and looked like a wound to anyone who did. He swore something to himself that had the taste of iron. Caitlin smiled with the dignity of a woman who had learned as a girl not to give men too much of her face lest they make stories out of it. Brandon was handsome enough that his vows sounded like a gift he thought to bestow. Later he would learn to make them sound like a gift he had received. He would be taught by circumstance and by his wife, both stern instructors in different modes. South of all of this, the court crawled. Ares dreamed of burning, woke, and found his son watching him with the look a man gives when measuring the space between 2 accidents. The king turned to his jars again, and because it is often true that men are saved from themselves by the small failures of small tools, a shelf gave way and 2 jars cracked, and the smell of alchemical temper filled the room and made men coo. "GH and quit it." Jaime's hand moved of its own accord and he steadied the king. The king shoved him away as if the touch had an itch in it. On that day, Rhaegar learned that accidents could be allies. He learned also that allies could be accidents. He learned that sometimes, when one does not open the window to an excuse, the excuse will find another house. He collected these lessons as if they had been coins scattered on a floor in a painter's studio. Bran pulled back from the heat. He took to the cool north and stood on a parapet no one else could see. He watched the yard where boys who would be men were laughing with a kind of freedom that is the birthright of those who do not yet know what will be asked of them. He looked at Benjen and saw the night waiting in him. He looked at Ned and saw a series of rooms he would enter and leave with his quiet dignity intact. He looked at Brandon and saw a man who would break hearts through his own lack of caution before the world had a chance to break his. He would be forgiven often and then finally not. He looked at Lyanna and saw all the corners of a woman's life she would test with a finger the way a baker tests a crust. It should have pinched him with sorrow to notice how much had already changed from the world he had lost. Instead, a peace came, strange and thin as the first ice on a pond. He would not become a gardener who believes he owns the weather. He would not pull weeds because he disliked their flowers. He would go where he felt the grain of time weakening and put a palm there, steady, patient, attentive. Sometimes a hand is as powerful as a hurricane if you lay it correctly. News came up from the south like heat, always slower and then suddenly everywhere. The prince had called for a council, men said. He had used the words conciliation and reordering. He had named lords who had been named traitor in the king's own fireside rants and called them necessary. He had sent letters into corners of the realm that had not been asked for their opinion loudly in a generation. Men in the mountains, men in the marches, men whose lands bookmarked other men's borders. Rieger had decided that if reform cannot be a war, then it must be an exercise in arithmetic. He counted what could be counted and waited for the remainder, always the remainder. Ares balked and preened and snarled and slept and woke and was convinced daily that men had stolen things from him. Rieger took the keys from his hand one by calling them something else. He did not say, "You have burned enough." He said, "I will attend to this for you, your hand is tired." And the king nodded as if the word tired was a compliment. Sometimes he failed. On those days Bran went south and put a chill into a room where the madness wanted to start a fire and distracted it by making it think itself ill. The king spoke then of fevers and old injuries and let the jars be, for an hour, for a day, until the habit was altered enough that in one corner of the castle a man took a different path to the kitchens and did not pass a door and so did not overhear something and carry it elsewhere. Small changes are the invention of peace. Bran learned to know their shape. He learned to feel when a man's footfalls in a corridor were off by half a breath because his heart was burdened by something he had not yet told his wife, and to give him a breeze like a wordless companion and so make him smile into his loneliness and so bring him home to her instead of to a cup or a knife. He learned not to be proud of these things. Pride would have turned him into a tyrant more delicate than the king whose fires he was dousing. Sometimes nothing had to be done. Littlefinger set his hooks with the care of a jeweler and would have raised a net from the river heavy with trusting fish. Then he lifted his head one morning and found his desire to leave the riverlands for the city wearied by a dream of a narrow bed and a boyhood laugh and a stone in his shoe. He put off his journey without knowing why. He went a week later and arrived at a time that made a certain introduction fizzle. He recalculated the way men like him are born to do. Sometimes Bran arrived late. A rider was already galloping. A map had already been spread. A squire had already stolen a kiss that would sour a man's dinner and make him meaner at the board than he would otherwise be. Bran could not be everywhere at once, and time would not allow him to revise his own absence. He learned to leave those scenes alone if he could not make them better. He learned not to injure time by poking it where it had already scabbed over. In the Vale, Jon Arryn watched his wards with a proud heart and an ache in his back that nothing cured. He saw in Robert a promise and a peril. He saw in Ned a steadiness that made him imagine long roads without complaint. He dreamed of the realm under a calmer hand. When rumors came later, much later, after other corners had been quieted, asking whether he would give up those boys' heads for the king's pleasure, he measured the question and found it nonsensical. No one asked a question that stupid in this calmer year. His steward burned the rumor without telling him because he was proud enough to believe himself the filter for his lord's day. Rieger did one brave thing that could have ended very badly. He went to Tywin Lannister and asked him to be hand again. It was like asking Winter to be reasonable. He did not flatter the lion. He offered him a problem intricate enough to seduce him. He spoke of coin and contracts and the architecture of cities. He did not say, "I need a leash for my father." He said, "We can build a stage on which my father's better performances will be invited and his worse will be crowded off." Tywin saw an outline of himself in those words and agreed because agreeing would give him a chance to write laws in his own stern script. The king swallowed the appointment because he had been convinced it was high. Esson within an hour of it being made. He touched the leonine sigil and said something sly that did not quite mean what he thought. He called for his jars and then forgot about them because Tywin had arrived to discuss walls and roads with numbers in his hand, and the king liked the feel of numbers sliding between his fingers even if he did not understand how men used them to make things. When the riders from Dorne came with a letter asking after the king's health and suggesting a visit, a politeness heavy enough to be in order in a different season, Rieger went out of the city gates to meet them before they reached the first postern. He helped Elia down from her palanquin and kissed her hand with something like remorse and something like hope. He asked after the children and did not do that thing princes do when they ask after their children and look at their servants to hear the answer. He asked Elia and he listened, and the sound of his listening made her straighten a fraction, and the fraction was everything. Men who had counted on a war began counting other things. They counted contracts and futures and routes. They counted favors. Some of them counted how many nights they could spend away from the capital without being accused of indifference. They were bored in a way they did not know how to confess. Men whose trade is in blood do not always know what to do with their hands when the air is not choked with it. They became clumsy lovers or ugly gamblers. Some of them became fathers in a way they had not expected and were startled to find the practice tolerable. Some of them grew angry at the waste of their sharpened skills and tried to make trouble like boys make fires in sheds for the joy of it. Trouble, robbed of a reason, burns itself quickly. The second hinge came in a room nobody saw. Varys had papers in his hand and a river in his voice, and he breathed a breath with a note in it he had not been born with. He had begun to feel the attention of the trees as one feels a cat watching from a balcony above a street. He brought Rhaegar word of a whisper that could have set the king's madness flaring. He offered a trap for it that involved 3 men and a room and no fires. The trap was set, and it worked because men accustomed to using fire as their ally forget that smoke tells on you. 3 men were sent away to their country houses without guards or visible shame and told their accounts would be audited. A king's fury is not always the most dangerous math. Tywin looked on with neutral satisfaction. He preferred punishment that paid interest. Bran watched and felt the world's skin knit. The scar would be there, a line men could trace with a finger and say here was crisis, here we nearly bled out. But the skin held. He used his care elsewhere. Then, because the realm is not one ship but fleets, not one city but a field of sowings and reapings. He went north more often and sat in the weirwood and learned again how wind is the music of absence. He watched a boy in the yard who moved with a different balance than his brothers and saw in him a hunger to make sense of what he could not see. He watched a girl who did not care to be called pretty and did not yet know whether the insult or the compliment in that would be the more imprisoning. He watched a babe born to Brandon and Catelyn who had a set to her mouth that looked like the river's own. In his own cave, the old man's breathing grew thin and then steadied, the stubborn thread of it refusing to break. The children of the forest would touch him sometimes with hands light as whispers. They looked at Bran as if he had done both more and less than they had expected. He asked them nothing because questions require names for answers, and he had learned that names are weak things here. He asked the trees instead, and they gave him back what he gave, attention for attention. He tried to love them the way one loves a mountain, with respect for their indifference. There were nights he dreamed flames that were not Ares's and woke with the taste of cold in his mouth that was not winter's ordinary savor. The white that had taught him to be wary, the night that rises and asks if men have remembered it rightly, did not forget him because he kept a king from his jars for a season. The work he had chosen in the south did not alter the fact that what comes from the north comes whether men are ready or not. He laughed into the moss once, hearing himself strange and far, at the foolishness of men who think they can handle only one danger at a time. Lyanna and Robert took to their bargain with uneven ardor. There were weeks when he kept every small faith, and she forgot herself long enough to say so aloud and kiss him with a lack of ceremony that pleased him more than any feast. There were weeks when he failed and she reminded him, and he threw a cup at the wall and then picked up the shards himself and cut himself and swore and then laughed because he would rather bleed than apologize. He learned to do both. She learned to be infuriated without now letting infuriation drive her out into cold fields where only horses would hear her sense. They taught each other more than they liked and less than they had promised. Marriage is made of such arithmetic. Ned went south to stand at Rhaegar's council once that summer, the only Stark in a circle of men who thought winter a story told to keep boys cautious. He listened to the prince and to the eunuch and to the lion and heard things he liked and disliked in each. He came home with a bag of southern salt his sister had begged and with a new habit of tying off knots twice. Winterfell did not change in the face of his news. Winterfell has always been restrained in its interest in southern gossip. But the cooks used the salt in a stew and declared it strange in the mouth and satisfying afterward. That seemed metaphor enough. Time does not stop because men have chosen wisely once. It brings other questions, summit. Dressed as opportunities. Rhaegar wanted to study as his forebears had studied only when they had grown fat on victory. He had no such fat. He had lean concern. He asked for schools and was told by shrewder men than he that schools produce readers and readers produce rebels. He asked for roads and was told by the same men that roads produce armies. He learned to ask for granaries instead. He learned where to place a thing in men's imaginations so that they would forget it had once been a dangerous word. Elia laughed once and said he had married politics and come to enjoy its caresses. He looked embarrassed and then honest and said, "Yes." On a day ordinary in its weather, a raven lifted from the rookery at the Red Keep and made its way to Dragonstone with a letter that had been written in a small hand and signed by a large one. It told of a fortification on the Blackwater that needed repair and a man who had offered to do it cheaply who had not done anything cheaply in his life. It told of a grain levy that had increased infant survival in a district with a name most courtiers could not pronounce. It told trivial triumphs and tedious failures, and at the end, under the sign of the hand, it said, "Your Grace, perhaps we are not cursed men. Perhaps we are merely slow learners." The king stared at the words until the letters swam. He did not know whether to be flattered by the plural. He crumpled it and then could not bear the feel of crumpled paper and smoothed it out with hands that trembled and then did not. Elsewhere, an aging knight in white found that the weight of his cloak had more meaning than he had thought it did when he first put it on. He saw service as something other than standing and shining. He went into a small alley near the Street of Silk on his day off and stopped a beating that had been carried out in the name of a lover's quarrel and sent a man to the maesters who would have bled out otherwise and then went and told no one. Virtue seeks no heralds because heralds charge fees. He stood later that evening at his post and did not resent the king for commanding nothing of him but stillness because he had learned to make stillness thick with intention. When word of a skirmish on the Dornish marches came, a scrape between proud boys with lances and fathers with money, Rhaegar sent not soldiers but letters and a cartload of water for the men who wanted to be thirsty on the way home from their reconciliation. Men remember the water when they forget the letter. Oberyn rolled his eyes and said it tasted of northern prudery. He drank and refilled his cup twice. A season slid forward without catastrophe. It felt strange to men accustomed to measuring years by war. In taverns there were fewer toasts to dead heroes and more arguments about whether the price of wheat was being set fairly in the market. Priests called it dull and prophesied that dullness is only peace wearing poorly. Men of accounts smiled and sharpened their quills. Wet nurses told a new crop of babies that they had been born in a lucky spell and laughed to hear their own optimism. Bran sat beneath the trees and let himself feel, for the first time since he had slid into the river of time, a thing like relief. He had not built a city. He had not slain a dragon. He had not rewritten songs. He had caught stones before they sank, and he had placed them where they could be stepped upon without starting a mudslide. He had done this with whispers and waits and the kind of patience that kills the boy in a man and leaves behind the man who can tend a field. He had done harm that he had not wanted to do. He knew it. The lives that had been swapped out for other lives weighed in the palm of his understanding like coins. He did not spend because they did not belong to him. He did not expect thanks. He did not expect even to be noticed. But he noticed. That was his gift. He watched Lyanna ride at dawn with her hair tied simply and a smile on her mouth that had not been there the day she met a prince in the shade of a god. He watched Robert sit with a book and curse it and then pick it up again and ask a boy in the library to explain a clause as if he were asking a blacksmith to explain a join. He watched Ned walk the battlements at dusk and count the men who could be relied on by the number of times they stopped and looked out beyond the walls rather than down at their shoes. He watched Brandon learn the first hard lesson of marriage, how to speak and not win, and not break himself on it. In the South, he watched a king not burn a city. That was miracle enough for 1 year. The leaves whispered for their own reasons as the summer deepened, because leaves have their own agendas, turning light into sugar, pumping, making their green from the blood of old stone. Bran put his ear to their business and heard beyond it the low, long note that had always underlaid his labors. The note that comes from far north of any garden or court. It reminded him that the first engines of horror do not mind whose king sits on which chair. They mind doors and breaches and warmth. He did not mistake a year without rebellion for a world without threat. When the first thin ice appeared on a bucket left under the eaves at Winterfell, a sound like a distant horn drew him awake from a sleep that had left an impression of a dream like boot prints in snow, already softening. He sat up in the cave and felt the roots croon around him, old lullabies no man had taught to them. He put his hand on the weirwood's white bark and gave thanks without words to all the small mercies that had held while he wrought and watched. He imagined for a moment what it would be to walk into the yard at Winterfell and let his mother see him and say his name. He imagined stepping into the sun at King's Landing and letting men who thought themselves cunning all feel, for once, as if the air had told them a secret they were not entitled to hear. He imagined his father's hand on his hair as if he were still a boy who could be scooped up. He let the images come and then he let them walk away. If he did the one thing he wanted most, if he reached for love more than for duty, the rope he had braided might unplait in a single mad tug. He pressed his palm harder into the bark until it hurt. He learned to use the hurt as a tether. He returned to watching as a woodsman returns to a snare. Quietly, attentively, with the knowledge that having caught one danger does not prevent a dozen others from loping along the same path. There would be new feasts, new letters, new jars, new husbands, new fathers, new fights in tack rooms that could bloom into duels if left without a witness. There would be councils that bored men until their boredom made them rash. There would be nights when the king's hand went to a jar and could not remember why it had wanted what it had wanted. There would be mornings when Lyanna would wake and think she had made a mistake and then rise and make the day keep promises with her. There would be a boy at the wall who would look beyond it and call back into the world with a voice he did not yet know belonged to him. The rope held. The stones stayed where he had placed them. He felt the tug of the north, the pull of the place where names end. He whispered into the wood, not as a god, not even as a judge, only as a boy who had learned to be a steward. He told the trees thank you. He told light and dark both that he had no intention of giving either of them more than their due. He told the men of this world nothing. He would keep on not telling them until the day came when telling would be the only thing to do, when the word would unlock a door instead of jamming it. On that day, which had not yet arrived, there would be time enough for bravery. For now there was only patience, which is the first bravery and the last. He lay back down beside the root, and the cave folded its cool around him, an old woman's shawl with mended places. In the yard at Winterfell a woman laughed, and a man cursed at a book, and a boy struck a wooden post until his hands stung, and then bowed to it as if it had taught him something. In the capital a prince counted and did not stop. In the throne room a king fell asleep in a chair that did not claim to cure him, and dreamed not of fire but of a road under trees, and woke angry for having been given an honest thing. Bran closed his eyes. In the dark behind them there were branches laden with a season that no one yet knew how to name. He listened to the sap rise, to the slow conversation of wood with wind, and he was content to be, for this one moment, only what the trees had made him. A witness who had learned where to put his hand and when to remove it. He had almost convinced himself that it would be enough to go on listening forever when the first warning came on feet as small as buttons. The child of the forest moved like an owl's thought, noiseless and exact, and stopped with her hand on the root that fed Bran's shoulder and cheek and hip. Her face was a whirl of ages that had put themselves in the wrong order on purpose. She did not blink often. When she did it was like an eclipse. "The white," she said, and the word was not a color. "It is not waiting." He felt it through the wood a heartbeat later. He had learned to read the sap's slow news. Now it trembled with a bright, thin pain along the inner ring, as if frost were trying to scribble on it with a broken nail. He followed that strain as one follows a river's odd stain back to a tannery and found, north of the true north, a line along the snow where it did not glint the way honest winter glints. A silence spread there that was not the stillness he had loved from boyhood when drifts made the world into a listening room. This silence gathered, like a man drawing his cloak tight to keep out more than cold. It had an intention in it. It had breath. In that terrible hush moved shapes that had borrowed the idea of men without understanding what men are for. Their pieces took light badly. Their edges were so exact they made the wind's own edges look soft. They came not as a storm comes, with laughs and boasts, but as a map of erasure. Behind them stumbled the things that had once had names and would have preferred to keep them. The dead are not often asked. He pulled back to his body with a speed that made the cave sway. The old man stirred and did not wake. The children's hands had already begun to move in patterns that were as practical as any cook's. They did not ask him what he would do. They had seen what men do when they are told what they should. He pressed his palm harder to the root until its skin remembered his and his remembered it, and then he took the wood's patience with him like a cloak and went into the north. At the top of the wall, a man stood whose youth had been spent looking into distances. Benjen Stark had taken the black with the kind of quiet that makes vows heavier. He had not been called to glory, and so glory had not distracted him. He let the cold enter him the way a teacher enters a room. Stern, expected, and with a kind of affection it will never confess. When the ravens changed their minds about where to sit, and the dogs tucked their noses under their tails, and even the brass of the bell felt colder than brass ought to feel, Benjen put his gloves on and walked the topmost course, counting the stones because counting keeps fear from borrowing your hands. Bran put his breath under his brother's breath, the way a wind puts its shoulder under a door when a man has been trying too long to lift it alone. He showed him, in the polished belly of ice that took every color and made it pale, a flicker of movement where no movement should be this hour. Benjen did not start. He finished his count. Then he said the two words that can move mountains when the man who says them means them. Wake them. The horn blew and did not sound as splendid as the S. Ungs pretended. It sounded like an old man calling boys in from a field where wolves had been seen. But the boys came, and the men, and the old ones who had been men so long they knew every place a boot fails. Bran was in a man's hand when it reached not for a sword but for a wrapped bundle that contained dragonglass arrowheads. He was in an oath in the throat of a boy who had joined the watch because he had been told he must go somewhere and picked the place people said not to pick. He was in the iron of the gate that slid down at the right moment. He was in the memory of a tale told by a deserter years ago that had been laughed at by men who had not seen as far as he had stood to see. The first sighting of the white things that night did not become a slaughter. It became a retreat that did not forget to be orderly. Sometimes victory wears that face first. He sent ravens like thoughts. They burst from the belfries and the towers. They spilled from trees that had learned to nod when told to nod. They went to Maester Luwin at Winterfell, and to a young maester at Eastwatch whose eyes had a hunger for the line between rumor and fact. They went to the Eyrie and to Storm's End and to the Red Keep. They went to a man mending a net on a rocky shore and to a woman grinding grain in a holdfast where men had become lazy about their walls. He did not write words in their beaks. He pressed unease into their wings, the kind that makes a man lift his head at last and look at the weather. In King's Landing, Rhaegar bent over a list the way a smith bends over a sword and looked up before the eunuch finished saying winter, as if the word had been waiting in his ear. "We will need stone," he said first, "and old trades." The hand did not smile because a lion's face is poorly built for it, but his eyes showed the satisfaction of a man who had fought for the right to be useful and won. "And law," Tywin said, "law that can be executed in mud, not only in ink." "Obsidian," Rhaegar said, "the old name, dragonglass. Dragonstone's miners have been idle too long." He did not look to Stannis Baratheon to say it, which was courtesy, and looked to him to do it, which was respect. Stannis nodded once, which was as much as a salute as he gave men who had not earned it. He went down to his ships with his jaw set and his ledger open. At Winterfell, Lyanna was already standing in the yard in a cloak she had mocked and grown fond of, speaking to men who preferred certainty to pay. "You will be paid," she told them. "In coin you can spend and in something better." "What could be better?" a man asked who had never been hungry and so did not know how stupid he sounded. "In our memory," she said, "and our daughters." She looked at the boy who had stammered out his oath in the yard last snow, and who would stammer it again on the wall if he was asked to repeat it, because repetition is sometimes the only real courage we are offered. She thought of sons. She did not think of songs. She sent carts north with the sort of brisk authority that makes men who have grown too fat stand up straight without knowing why. Robert rode out with a train of men who did not gape as much as courtiers gape, but still gaped a bit, because Robert on a horse looks like a man a poet invented to keep boys awake in boring sermons. He was not bored now. He had not touched a cup since the news. He no longer held his life like a trinket he had not yet decided where to wear. He held it like a hammer. He hammered on doors that had not been hammered on in a long while. Wintertown, White Harbor, the little places whose names are more useful in winter than the names of any city. He asked what men needed and did not scold them for saying too little or too much. He laughed more softly and swore with a music that made his squires straighten. Lionel rode on his left and did not correct him where he had chosen well. She corrected him where he would have lost a day for a gesture. She did it with a look. He took the look like medicine. Ned went across the neck with Howland Reed, because the marsh knows him and because the path that looked shortest on a map is often the one that will drown a man to his chin and then decide whether to spit him out. They moved among reeds that had been named for reed for so long the word had forgotten its beginning. They spoke to women who knew how to make a light that does not show to wolves from a smear of fat and a wick that would shame most men's wives in neatness. They left behind bundles and huts where men had hung bones to remind themselves they were more than meat. Dragonglass glittered in those bundles, wicked and honest both. Knives you could hide in the laugh lines of an old man's face and pull free when the white came. Letters went to Old Town and men there did what men there do. They argued about whether the world was as old as it now seemed to be and whether the old stories were mistakes that had taught men to fear shadows instead of substance. One maester whose hands had the scars of a boyhood in a forge wrote in a margin, "Whether or not it is the same shadow, we will be colder if we spend so long debating the candle we forget to light it." He requested obsidian and received it and found that it wanted to chip in a certain direction and not in others. He learned to let the rock have the first word and the last. He taught boys to sharpen with more patience. He taught an old ranger how to set a tip into a shaft so that it would not shake itself free before it needed to be free of something else. Bran learned the other as one learns a language, by listening to how it refuses to say certain words. It moved along lines that had been fences when the world was young. It hated the sound of water falling from high places. It disliked dogs in the way a man dislikes a mirror that does not flatter. It took men's flaws and made them brittle, not elastic. The angry became sharper, the cowardly more certain. He watched where it feared and asked himself not how to fight it but how to starve it. There are wars won by famine. The first victory was an accident that would have become a tragedy if he had nudged it wrong. A caravan caught on a windswept road within sight of the wall by men who had made the mistake of believing that the dead would stay in their neat graves if the earth was frozen. Ben-Jen sent out a small party with eyes like fish in cloudy water. Dragonglass cracked on bone where it met it. Men bled and did not notice until later. No songs were made. Men grunted and swore and wept when they had the leisure after. The survivors had equal numbers of men bowing their heads and men standing in the open and breathing the way men breathe after they have jumped from a height and not died. The important thing was the pace with which the news traveled. Fast enough to frighten fools, slow enough to bring wise men to tables instead of horses. Some years can hold both speeds. This one did. Rhaegar called a council at Moat Cailin because the old fortress sat in the throat of the land where a mistake could be stopped and a decision could be heard. The towers there had leaned into one another for so long that even if hate had wanted to climb them, it would have had to go in single file. Men came with the look of those who have repented of underestimating a thing and are embarrassed to admit it. Priests came and did not bristle at seeing priests of other gods because cold treats all gods equally. Tywin brought ledgers and did not flaunt them. Varys walked softly and listened hard. Elia came with her son at her breast and her daughter at her hand because a mother is an argument no man can refute without insulting the only victory he truly understands. The oath they made in that ruin was not elegant. It was leaned on more than it was spoken. They let the old gods be witnesses, and the faith and the red god and a priest of the drowned who kept his mouth shut because men were giving him bread in a season when bread should be silent. Rhaegar put his hand on the white bark of the old stump and did not recoil from the resin. He said only, "We will do the work that keeps men warm." It sounded like nothing. It was everything. Bran poured himself down into the wood and pressed there until he could not tell whether he was tree or boy. He learned a word that was less a word than a way of letting two very different things sit close without injuring one another. He carried that shape into the wall when he returned north, and the wall responded the way a great animal responds to an old song it has not heard in a long time. It lifted its head. It remembered it was built to hold and not only to be admired. The Red Priests came to Eastwatch with fires in bowls and eyes that had seen light press itself into the eyes of men who had been starving for warmth their whole lives. Ben-Jen and the oldest of the Watch's men watched them without blinking. "We will take your heat," the old man said. "We will not take your king." The priest, a woman whose hair had gone white on one side and black on the other, as if she had slept for years with her head half under a blanket, smiled the way a mother smiles when a child has learned a whole sentence. "There is only the cold we fight," she said quietly. "Names may be added later if men must do that to sleep." They made fires that did not go out and stood them along the inner road like a line of nodding elders. It was a winter of craft, as much as of courage. Men who had been proud of standing and bleeding learned the humility of sharpening 500 arrowheads. Women who had been proud of bearing sons learned the worth of making sure those sons' hands would not blister when given shovels instead of spears. Even the greatest worked in small ways. Rieger counting what could be counted without lying to himself. Robert walking through a holdfast with his knuckles grazing beams to feel where the wood had softened under damp and shouting for thatch to be mended. Tywin figuring out how to move ice without spending the lives of those who moved it. Howland Reed whispering to a midwife that the baby should be wrapped in a certain herb's smoke because winter takes well to certain scents and poorly to others. Bran kept his hand where it mattered and took it away where it did not. He learned to be sparse even in his magic, to let men own their work. Then winter stood up. It did not howl. It arrived at the Milkwater as a piece of the world that had decided to be less alive. Men who had been boys last season stood their ground as well as anyone ever has. The others came not with numbers that would make a man drop his blade in despair, but with an exactness that made skill blush. The first line of men held because Ben-Jen did not ask them to be brave beyond their shape. He asked them to do what they had practiced. One fell because he wanted to be a hero. One lived because he wanted to see his wife again and realized wanting could keep a man from doing anything stupid for a long while. Obsidian did what it has always done when asked honestly. Valyrian blades sang the old note. The Red Priest's fire took the whites and spared the men because it had been made with care. Even a few spears of good honest pine rammed home by hands that were not trembling found purchase in the chests of the dead because the dead do not like what in life is used to build houses, and pine is a house tree. It was not a rout. It was not a victory. It was a message sent in the only way winter and men can send messages to one another, with breath. Winter said, "I will not be hurried." Men said, "We will not be moved while we can be made to wait." Stannis was given what he had always suspected was his. A task that would not reward him and would kill him if done wrong. He took his ships into a fog that stuck to sails like regret. The cold that came off the sea that night was a thing he would later think of, in the lonely chamber he slept in, as a teacher finally arriving with the right book. He had to bring Obsidian to a handful of places and not to others. He had to listen to a voice he did not like. Varys through a speaking tube he mistrusted, and then Ned in person on his deck with a hand on the rail because the movement of a ship is a conversation that can make a man sick if he speaks at the wrong time. Stannis listened, and his sailors watched him listen. And because they had not often seen him listen without the shape of contempt on his mouth, they did their exact work with a steadiness that surprised them. The fog thinned once at just the right moment for a set of boats to steer into a little harbor where a line of men waited with barrows. The giants carried with the same care they would show a sleeping child. Stones do not impress giants, but requests can. "Hard home," men whispered, and the word the free folk used for the place did not sound like the maps. It sounded like something a mother says when she is trying to keep a baby asleep. Bran went there as smoke goes nowhere. He saw the bones that had come from good lives and bad and no one's fault and every man's fault. He saw fear in eyes that still knew how to laugh between breaths. He put his notice on a man who had been a singer before he was a father and let the river of his endurance run clear of pride. He found a woman whose hair had already gone white in streaks that marked every winter she had lived through and gave her the image of a road without an ambush. He found a boy whose name he did not learn and put into his hand the memory of a stick being whittled by a grandfather who had died with his boots on and a joke half told. These are small gifts. They can keep a world from falling while it figures out how not to. For all the petty marvels, he understood that a larger thing waited, patient and grim. The others were not men and had no need of feasts. But they had a mind, and that mind had a center. He could feel it. The cold with a crown. It was not a man's crown and not a child's. It was a kind of agreement the white had made with itself to be more than weather. He had avoided naming it because names are handles, and if you grip a handle wrong it takes you where it wants to go. Now he would learn its name. He went back and back, deeper into the wood than the old man had counseled. The roots here did not taste like sap and rain. They tasted like iron and knives. The memory of the first agreement between hot and cold was almost too sharp to touch. He found women who were not women and men who were not men making a weapon because they had been given no other craft that satisfied their fear. He saw a blade of black pushed into a breast to bind winter to a shape. He thought, as he had not thought when he was a boy with nothing to lose, that it is a terrible thing to be right for the wrong reason. He felt the word that had been spoken then. It was not a word in any tongue men still used. It was an intention made into a knot. He memorized the knot with his bones. If he were to untie it, he would give away something he could not get back. He ran his mind along his own life like a man's hand runs along a wall searching for the notch that hides a door. He found the first place he had been only a boy, his brother's hand on his hair, his mother's voice calling him by a name only she used when she wanted him to stop climbing, his father's quiet after a battle he had won without raising his voice. He found the last place he had been only a boy, the door, the friend, the ruin of a name. He put his griefs in a row like cups and he drank them. He did not flinch when the last one burned. He had sworn to himself he would not spend another man's mind to buy his own victories. This price would be his. He returned to the wall at a dusk that made the world the color of bone. Men stood with faces bowed to let snow find their foreheads before fear did. The wind had quieted in the way it does just before it decides to turn one way or the other. The line of white that came out of the trees looked like a feast cloth drawn across a table. Carried no banners. It needed none. It did not scream. It did not bother with that form of courage. It arrived with the dignity of the thing it had always been. Benjen did not shout. He raised his hand like a man ordering a drink at a bar where he knows his coin is good. The horn blew, once, twice, again, and the notes felt old enough to have been carved into the stones themselves. Men took their places. The first rank would not all live to see the second rank move. They did not ask this of themselves. They asked only to do their part cleanly. Bran stepped into the wood until the bark was his mouth. He let the knot he had learned rise into his hands. He spoke then, but not in a voice the ear could hear. He spoke in the way that ice speaks when it decides not to bear weight and gives warning in 100 tiny cracks. He spoke in the way that a woman's breath changes just before she gives a birth that will end one life and begin another. He spoke in the way birds know when to turn all at once. He spoke to the white crown, not with anger. Anger is a weak language between very old enemies, but with memory. He told it what it had been when it was born. He told it of the choice it had been denied. He told it of a hill covered with wind, and the feel of a hand on a chest, and the word the children had made that had meant hold in a way men did not understand. He told it he would give back what had been taken only if it took back what it had given away. Its will to be more than winter. The first line of men saw a movement in the white that looked like thought. Then the second line saw the white begin to fray at the edges like a garment that had been mended too often. Then the third line heard a noise come out of their own chests that they did not know their chests could make. A kind of chord, not a cheer. A sound the body makes when something older. Then fear leaves it. The crowned cold did not shatter. The world is not as dramatic as poets are. It stepped back the smallest space, and in that space everything else moved forward. The first spearhead made of obsidian found a breast where a rib had been shaped wrong by the story that held it. The second found a wrist that had been nothing but hunger. The third missed and then was picked up by a man whose father had taught him not to leave good work lying in the snow and set into another shaft and thrown again by a hand that had not learned to throw but had learned to try. The white retreated the way a frost retreats from a window when the sun decides it will. It did not apologize. It did not need to. It simply conceded a season. Later, men would argue about when precisely the thing broke. A single moment, a meeting of eyes, a horn blown at the just right pitch. They would be wrong. It broke because a boy who had become a tree remembered well enough the first knot that tied the world to this trouble and untied it enough to make the next knot different. It broke because men stood and did not do more than they could. It broke because a woman on a hill far south that afternoon snatched her child from a puddle and laughed instead of crying. And because the laughter traveled farther than she would ever walk. He let go. The price took him gently, which is the worst way for a price to take you because it keeps you from hating it. Something small and dear went, perhaps the ability to taste honey as only honey and not as a metaphor for other good things. Perhaps the memory of his own hands before they had become tools for greater work. He did not check. He did not look back as one does not look back when leaving a house one has grown too big for. Men cheered as men cheer, badly and loudly, and then they stopped because the cold made clapping hurt. They leaned against one another and behaved like animals who have decided they will still be alive at sunset. Benjen leaned on the parapet and looked out into the gray and did not have words. He said the one he had, now. He sent orders down not to celebrate, that would come because the body demands its portion, but to repair, to sleep, to eat, to put away the dragonglass as if it were a child's toy and not the edge between breathing and not. He did not allow anyone to think the war had been won. Men died after battles won as easily as after battles lost, if fools were allowed to explain what had happened. The true winter pulled back over several days. Not like a cape, but like a man's hand pulling wool from a thorn bush. In the gaps left behind, life sprouted with the impatience that is life's most lovable sin. Bran withdrew. He found himself shaking as if his skin belonged to weather. The old man opened his eyes and looked at him as if seeing him anew. "You are still what you were," he said, voice thin as parchment. "And you have become what the world needed." He closed his eyes again and took another season in that breath. Ravens flew in patterns that had no precedent. One went to Dragonstone and struck Stannis on the ear by accident. He slapped the side of his head and swore and then laughed, a short, sharp bark that startled the men nearest him. "We are not dead," he announced to his empty cabin, as if someone had been arguing the other case. He sat and wrote a letter he did not reread and sent it to a woman he loved as a man loves the law, stiffly and with more loyalty than warmth. She wept when she read it and would never show anyone because men can ruin anything by watching. In King's Landing a cry went up, not of fear, but of relief's twin, which is exhaustion. The king sat for a long time with his chin on his chest, then lifted it and found his son watching and nodded once. He did not abdicate. He did not make a speech. He said, "I am tired." Rhaegar said, "You may be." Tywin stepped forward with a paper that had been written weeks ago and signed and sealed with a hand steadier than anyone would have predicted and announced a regency the way a man announces the changing of a watch in a lighthouse. No fuss, only certainty. The city exhaled. Some men went to brothels and some to seps and some to corners where they could press their faces into their hands and not be seen doing it. Life was vulgar and holy in the same quarter hour. That is how life wins. At Winterfell they held a feast that had less meat than they wanted and more bread than they had expected. The candles made a moving river above men's heads. Children fell asleep on benches and were carried to bed without waking. Lyanna and Robert stood in a corner and mourned nothing for once. Ned made his way through the hall one patient footstep at a time and said a kind word to every man he would need and some he would not. Brandon laughed too loudly twice and corrected himself. Later, by a fire that had no witness but his wife, he thanked her for saying nothing about it in the hall, and she kissed him in the way one kisses a man one has decided to make better rather than perfect. When the music began, it did not sound like the court's idea of music. It sounded like home. A harp was brought out that had been tuned by someone who knew work, and Rhaegar, in the north for the first time without the weight of suspicion on his shoulders, played and did not make anyone feel small. He looked up once while his fingers were at their exact business and met Lyanna's eyes across the moving air and bowed the smallest bow, acknowledging a debt that had become a friendship forged of a courage rarer than the kind men sing of, the courage to return to a choice and remain with it because it was right. Bran watched from the godswood because that was the habit he could not lay down without laying down too much. The weirwood's face did not change. Trees' faces seldom do. But its attention did, and he felt in that attention something like permission. "Go," the child of the forest said at his shoulder.
Per.
At PS, it is time to go. He had not allowed himself the thought. He had been tree and boy both so long that choosing one felt like insulting the other. He asked the wood to be honest with him. It is a terrifying thing to ask honesty of something older than your questions. The sap rose, the roots settled. He felt the pattern that had been missing since the first door he had ever opened in himself. A way back into the world without breaking the world to do it. They made a body for him out of what was at hand and what had been promised. It had bone because men must. It had sinew that remembered deer and wolf and the first man who ever stood upright to look into a storm and say not today. It had veins that were not sap and were not sap. The children's hands were deft, and the old man's eye opened at the end and saw and closed again as if satisfied to have checked a detail. He stood on legs that did not remember falling and took a breath of air not flavored by the mountain's long decay. He wept a little because it felt like robbery to take so much. The child touched his cheek with fingers cooler than a spring and said, "The wood will grow it back." He walked to Winterfell under a sky clean as flint. The wolves found him first, a gray blur and her mate, their eyes the color of old amber. They circled and sniffed and then lay down as if they had made up their minds. He put his hand to their heads and felt a rumble, greeting and warning both. He straightened and went on. The gate guards did not know what to do with him because some faces announced themselves as needing to be recognized. His did so without arrogance. He said, "I am Bran." And the word made the air of the yard shift as if it had not known it had been waiting to hear something until it heard it. Ned came as men like him come, to the very edge of haste, then stopping because haste can ruin joy the way it ruins judgment. He looked into Bran's face like a man who has been given a letter by a stranger claiming to be from a loved one and must decide whether to read it aloud. Lyanna came behind him with Robert, not touching but near. Brandon's mouth opened and closed. Then he laughed because sometimes the only way to show a world you are not its fool is to laugh at the moment when laughter is hardest. Howland Reed leaned in a doorway and watched, his small smile like a token given from the marsh to the hills. "I have watched," Bran said, because if he did not say it now, he would lie later by omission. "From trees, from birds, from men's habits. I have watched you live better than you were told you could. I am here now because it seems to me the watching may be done for a while." Ned's face changed the way dawn changes. "So slowly you must keep your eyes on it to notice. You are my son," he said, which was impossible if one counted years and mothers and such, and exactly true if one counted love and winter and the work men must do. "You are my brother's namesake," Brandon said. "If a name can jump time like a fish leaps a weir." Lyanna stepped forward and took his hand and turned it over, looking for a scar she had known once on a boy, found something else, and laughed. "I will keep you in line," she said, which in the North counts as affection. Robert clapped him on the back without breaking him, which is a skill all men should learn sooner than they do. "You owe me a story," he said, eyes bright with that hunger for truth that had been beaten flat in him by too many easy victories and was now swelling back to shape. He told them some things, not all, because the world does not accept truth undiluted the way it fails to accept spirits undiluted. He told them about Hodder, and he went to the stables and found Wylus and stood before him with the respect one gives a king and said the name he had stolen back into his hands. The big stable boy blinked once and then twice and then sat down on a bale of straw with an expression like a field after the first rain. "My name," he said, surprised and pleased and not angry because he had not had time to learn anger and it was not the right season for it. Bran sat with him until the light changed and told him about doors that were nothing at all and doors that were everything. They pressed their foreheads together and wept like boys who had seen too much and were permitted to be boys again for 1 hour. There was work immediately, because joy never arrives alone. The watch needed remaking not only in number but in kind. Benjen came south with 10 men whose eyes looked older than their teeth. They stood in the yard and looked at Bran and did not kneel because the watch does not kneel to anything but its wall. He walked among them and touched each by name he had learned in the wood and gave them not blessings, that is priest's business, but tasks. To one he gave the charge of teaching boys to sleep in cold without dying. To another the instruction to build a fire that did not go out when the wind changed. To a quiet man he gave a responsibility usually given to loud ones, to hear when men would break and send them south before they did. Ben-Jen took him aside and said little. They stood together and watched a cloud pass in front of the moon. Sometimes brothers must be enough to one another without words. This was one of those times. The king came north in the thaw, his hair like ash that had decided to gleam again. They met in the great hall because halls are good places for the kind of thing that was about to happen. Rhaegar approached not as a king approaches something he expects to own, but as a musician approaches an instrument only he knows he cannot play. He bowed, not too deep, which would have been vanity, and said, "You have done what I could not do. Tell me what you would have." Bran considered, and if he had allowed his boy's self to answer, he would have asked for names and songs and a house at the bend of a river. If he had allowed the tree to answer, he would have asked for silence. He let both speak, and then he did what he had begun to learn to do. He asked for the thing that would keep the world warm. "Leave me the north," he said. "Not as a kingdom, not as a prize, as a place where the old and the new speak to one another without a translator. Let me build the work here that will keep your children's children from forgetting what made them. Let the oaths sworn in summer not grow brittle in winter. And give me men willing to learn the old ways without turning them into games." "That is a great deal," Tywin said from behind the king, not disapprovingly. He was a man who admired a bold request made plainly. "It is nothing," Robert said, half laughing, half resentful in the way a man is resentful when someone else's goodness makes him more work for himself. "We will give him more," Lyanna said, and looked at her husband with a glance that amended orders the way a map amends a road, by being more persuasive than any argument. Rhaegar nodded. "I set here in office," he said, and the way he said it made new law. "Warden of the Weald and the Wall. It will be yours, and yours after you in such fashion as the North judges right, not only by blood's rules. You will speak for the living that are not men and for the dead who deserve remembering and for the men yet to be. When kings grow foolish, you will tell them what winter sounds like when it is honest. When priests grow certain, you will remind them that gods are not owned. You will have leave to take any road without paying the toll on anything but your patience." "And the watch?" Ben-Jen asked, not to spoil the mood, but because salt must be in bread. "It will be fed first," Rhaegar said promptly, as if he had been waiting a lifetime for the chance to say a sentence that made so much sense. "And manned by men we ask for every 10th harvest. Not criminals only, not boys only, but men whose hands remember making and not merely taking. When they have served 10 years and wish to lay down their watch, we will honor them as if they had been lords. We will not ask them to forget what they learned by standing in cold." He looked at Bran and added, "The crown will take care to be as old as it needs to be and as new as it must." There was a murmur that sounded like a tide crossing pebbles, men adjusting to words that were not poetry and would still be hard to keep. Tywin drafted quickly and with a precision that would have made a cruel teacher weep for joy. Varys traveled along the edges of the hall, agreeing with anyone who needed agreeing with and contradicting anyone who needed to be reminded that power without humility is a boy's game. Ned stood by a pillar and exhaled, a quiet that made the pillar feel used for the first time in years. Lyanna watched the maps in the men's heads redraw themselves and smiled in a way that would have scared her enemies had she any left in the room. Not all were delighted. A river lord with a face like a carp pursed his lips and spoke of tradition as if it were a coin he had earned to spend. A Dornishman with a sense of mischief flickered with impatience at the smell of piety. A Reachman did sums in his head and liked some of them and not others. A Bravosi in a corner scribbled and imagined contracts. A Septon wondered if prayers would sound different in the cold. A red priest whispered to her fire and nodded as if an agreement had been reached. Life began, again, to arrange itself around this new thing that had been named. It looked ordinary most days. That was its triumph. Bran rose at dawn and walked among men who were building a hall with no corners because the old gods dislike corners and men dislike drafts. Compromise is architecture's best trick. He sat with wolves and with children who had questions men could not stand to hear asked. and he answered them, or he told them he did not know, and the telling made them trust him more than answers would have. He went with Howland Reed into the marsh and learned a new way to read water. He leaned against the weirwood and let it lean against him. He rode once to the Shadow Tower, and once to White Harbor, and once as far south as the Mander, where he sat with an old man in a vineyard and talked about pruning, and was escorted out by a butler who did not know what to do with a boy who spoke like a book and a tree both. He did one big thing and never spoke of it except to two people. He went to where the door had been held and found the seam in time where his friend had been broken. He did not pull at it. He lay down beside it the way one lies down beside a crying child, and hummed in a key he had learned from the weirwoods. He did this for 3 nights and 3 days, and on the 3rd morning the seam loosened a hair. Wyllis woke from a sound sleep at Winterfell and turned his head and said, "Hotter," as he always had, and then, later that day, when no one had asked him a question at all, he said, "Wyllis," and smiled a small private smile, like a man who has told himself a joke and plans to keep it. Bran went into the God's Wood and wept and did not think it dignity to hide it. Aerys died in his sleep 2 winters later when the orange trees in the palace gardens bore fruit that tasted like apologies. Rhaegar mourned his father with a restraint that was not theatrical. He took the throne without a challenge because men had seen the work he had done while wearing less gold and learned that a man wearing more gold can still be the same man if he chooses. He crowned his son in a ceremony that made a song sound cheap. He thanked men who needed thanking and did not speak the names of men who had almost ruined everything because that would have been theater and he was tired of theater. He traveled north in a cloak lined with fur he had not paid for and gave it to a smith's wife who could not afford fuel that season. She did not know who he was. That suited him. Robert kept his bargains as a man keeps bargains that have been stitched into him by a Fae who has learned his shape. He failed and made amends and failed again and laughed and tried once more and sent for Ned when he did not know how to do it and sent him back when he realized he had been lazy. He sired children and loved them as men love weather, with curses and with a grin, learning to keep his rage out of their rooms and his boasting out of their ears. Lyanna rode and shouted at horses and allowed herself, sometimes, to be still and be loved. When she tried to die in a winter birth, the midwife slapped her hard and told her she was not permitted, and she obliged, and afterward she shaved the midwife's head and gave her a new comb because the old one had been full of old rules. Benjen's hair went gray at the temples and he smiled exactly once in public, when a boy who had been a thief by sentence and a singer by inclination shot an arrow so arched and true it would be told to children with improvements. He retired from the watch the way an old hunting dog lays down, with one eye still on the door. He trained boys to recognize tracks that were not tracks. He went south only once, to stand in the God's Wood with Bran and listen to the kind of winter a spring can remember. Tywin died with lists on his desk and laws in his head and no one to argue with, which is a real loss for a man like him. Cersei married not a prince but a lord rich enough to be inconvenient. She learned less than she might have from it, but her children learned enough. Jaime's cloak yellowed and then whitened with care. He found, to his astonishment, that vows have rewards not visible to men who have not kept them. He rode north once to stand silent under the wall and went back to the city and stood silent there and found the silences spoke to one another. Varys grew plumper and older and less certain and more useful. He began to like children in ways that had nothing to do with policy. He discovered, late and without flourish, that honesty is a kind of disguise when men have stopped expecting it. He helped Rhaegar keep his promises by the old method of breaking new ones before they grew into trouble. He wrote 2 letters that saved 2 lives and a 3rd that cost 1. He kept count and in his last days admitted once, to a boy who had very clean boots, that he had not known which had been wiser. The free folk did not become southlings and the southlings did not become wildlings, which pleased everyone. They became slightly more peculiar to one another and slightly less dangerous, which is a kind of victory. A giant came to Winterfell one summer as a guest, and boys laughed and were shushed, and a girl who had been learning to speak to wolves spoke to him slowly, and he wept because someone had taken the time to speak to him as if he were not a mountain. He left a stone at the foot of the heart tree taller than a man, and no one could ever decide whether it had grown there or been carried. Bran aged. It surprised him every day like a visitor who arrives whenever he pleases and is always welcomed. His hair went white in strands that had no interest in art. His hands grew knotted and accurate. His legs did not betray him because they were not asked to climb towers anymore. They were asked to walk among men and pause when men needed pausing at. He had students and did not call them that. Some could taste the wood and some could only see the way people are when no one watches. He taught both sorts to be kind without becoming fools. He and Howland fished one morning without bait and caught 3 stories and laughed until the fish got bored of them and swam away. Sometimes he needed nothing and went into the godswood and let the tree need him. The conversations there had grown companionable, as if 2 old men leaned on a fence and said very little and would be offended if one of them started to be clever. He went south less and listened north more. The white did not attempt another crown. Frost came and went like a man's temper. He attended to boys who would become men and girls who would become the tellers of truth at tables where lying had once been the sport. On a night when the lights in the sky moved as if gods were playing at being fishermen, he sat under the face that had watched his whole life and a little beyond it and listened. Winterfell murmured around him as a town murmurs when it is tired and content. Dogs, a lute, someone arguing over a game, someone making love carelessly and kindly. Footsteps approached, 3 sets. The gait he would have known anywhere now, a running step that refused to learn decorum, and a lighter tread that still made the gravel speak of caution learned in hard years. Ned stood there flanked by a boy with his father's jaw and a girl with her mother's blaze. He had lines on his face that told stories no man would ever read to an end. He looked at Bran as if to make sure he was there and would not vanish when spoken to. "I am thinking," he said, and that was still a warning and a promise when a Stark said it. "I am thinking of giving Winterfell to my son, and to my daughter other things that make men nervous. I would have your counsel." Bran laughed softly. "You would have it whether or not you asked," he said. "But asking honors us both." He looked at the boy, another Brandon, because families will not give up their habits, and at the girl who would one day tell her husband to throw his cups at the wall if he must and then sweep up, and he told them the true things about winter that are more useful than the glorious ones. He told them what men owe to those who cannot pay them back. He told them how to listen to a tree without killing it with questions. He told them that love is a chore when it is done properly. They did not roll their eyes. They were Starks. Later, when they had gone, he sat until the cold persuaded him to rise. He put his palm against the bark and did not ask for any more. He had been given more than any man has the right to expect: fire and time and the chance to place his hand where it would help. He had been allowed to repair his greatest harm. He had watched men he loved live long enough to be mistaken about things and then correct themselves. He had seen his enemies reveal themselves as frightened children and been spared the need to punish them. Snow began to fall, not with purpose, just because it does. Each flake made its choice and was not scolded for it. The wind moved through the branches, making a sound like the breath men make when they are ready to sleep. He walked out of the godswood and down the long slope toward the hall, his knees complaining like old retainers who complain only to be assured they are loved. And at the door he turned to look back at the white face and tilted his head the way a boy tilts his head at a riddle. "Thank you," he said, "not because gods need thanks, but because the saying is good for the mouth that says it." The hall's warmth came like a hand meeting his at the exact moment he offered his own. Men rose and made room. Wolves settled by the hearth like the town's own gossip, gentle and faithful. A harp waited in a corner and someone plucked it tentatively and someone else sang off-key and was not shamed. A cup was pressed into his hand that steamed with nothing stronger than spice and comfort. He lifted it and found faces turned toward him, some with reverence and some only with relief, which he hoped for more often. "To seasons," he said, and the simple toast took the room like a fire that does not burn but warms. They drank. The taste was enough, and then the next taste would be enough too, and the ones after that. He sat and listened to the talk of a world he had helped keep. In the grace between words, an old man could live out the rest of his days. Outside, the snow went on saying its thousand small things to the ground. In the woods beyond, the trees put their rings on quietly. At the wall, a watchman coughed, spat, stamped his feet, and smiled at nothing. Far south, a king looked at a sleeping child and forgot for an instant he was king. On a marsh, a heron stepped where it had always stepped and found what it had always found. On a ship, a sailor woke and did not know why and went back to sleep thinking of summer. Bran listened to all of it, and none of it needed fixing. When the wolves raised their heads at the same moment as if someone had touched a string between them, he lifted his gaze too, because habits make men happy. He felt the wood, the stone, the old slow breath of the world, and for the first time since he had fallen from a tower in a life that had not needed to happen, he felt unburdened. He smiled, and it was an ordinary smile, the kind a man gives his friends before he begins to tell them a story none of them have heard yet and all of them already know.